Ladies and gentlemen, it is now 2 p.m. GMT plus 8. So let us begin with a very good afternoon to our esteemed attendees joining us from all over the world. Welcome to this webinar on the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance, which is titled Contextualizing Transition for ASEAN. My name is Ines, and on behalf of the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum and Working Committee on Capital Market Development, thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that the housekeeping rules have been placed into the chat. The chat function has been disabled for attendees. However, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function available to table any questions that you may have, and make sure to include the name of the person to whom your question is directed to. We have also shared with you on the screen today the agenda. Our webinar will begin with an opening remark, followed by a presentation on the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance. We will then have a panel discussion and we'll close off with some closing remarks. Without further ado, let us now move on to the first agenda item for today, the opening remarks, which will be delivered by Pak Inarno Jajadi, the Chair of ACMF 2023 and the Chief Executive of Capital Market, Financial Derivatives and Carbon Exchange Supervisor at Otoritas Jasa Keuangan Indonesia. Pak Inarno, if I could invite you to switch on your camera, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ines. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on Asian Transition Finance Guidance, Contextualizing the Transition for Asia. Distinguished speakers, fellow regulators, chairs, co-chairs, and members of the Asian Capital Market Forum, Working Committee of Capital Market Development, Asian Insurance Regulators Meeting, Asian Senior Level Committee on Financial Integration, and Asian Taxonomy Board, and esteemed participants from diverse sectors across Asia. Transition finance plays a crucial role in achieving a net zero future. The ACMF and WCCMD have developed a roadmap and report respectively to promote sustainable finance in Asia. The roadmap and report outline key elements to enhance the sustainability finance ecosystem, which includes 3 pillars: taxonomy, transition, and disclosure. The Asian Transition Finance Guidance, launched during the ACMF conference on 18 October 2023, alongside the Asian Taxonomy, strengthened 2 of the 3 pillars of Asian sustainable finance ecosystem. The Asian Taxonomy provides threshold for different sustainability performance level for identified economic activities. The Asian Transition Finance Guidance complements the Asian Taxonomy by providing an approach to assess companies' forward-looking plans and facilitating investor support for transitioning companies. Honorable speakers and participants, the Asian Taxonomy has gained increasing interest and recognition worldwide. Similarly, the Asian Transition Finance Guidance has gained significant traction since its publication. Today's webinar is the 3rd event addressing the guidance, following a brief provided to ASIFMA on November 24, 2023, and a panel discussion on the role of the Asian Taxonomy and the Asian Transition Finance Guidance at the ADB Pavilion on December 2nd, 2023, during the COP28 in Dubai. The development of the Asian Transition Finance Guidance with support from the ADB is evidence of our commitment to contribute to the net zero agenda. The guidance addresses how entities may assess or demonstrate a credible transition in Asia for financing, aiming to accelerate the efforts of financial institutions to direct finance to transition companies and to create incentive for real economic companies with more ambitious and credible transition plans. Today's webinar is crucial as it brings together Asian regulators across financial sectors, capital market, insurance, banking sectors, and stakeholders from various sectors across Asia, including those from financial institutions and the real economy. Distinguished speakers and participants. Like the Asian taxonomy, the Asian Transition Finance Guidance is a living document and will be enhanced over time to reflect the progress in evolving global expectations and approaches, the changing needs of our region, as well as advances in technology. Our efforts have garnered global interest, and we will use this opportunity to consult with various stakeholders. We look forward to receive valuable insight from our distinguished panelists and participants during today's discussion. Simultaneously, through this webinar, we aim to introduce the guidance to the Asian companies, fostering awareness and encouraging more ambitious and credible transition pathways to meet the demand of capital providers. To end my remark, I extend my sincere appreciation to the organizing team, especially SC Malaysia and SEC Philippines as the co-chairs of the ACMF Sustainable Finance Working Group, SEC Philippines and Ministry of Finance and Economy of Brunei Darussalam as the co-chair of the WCCMD, Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, and ACMF Secretariat for their excellent coordination in organizing this webinar. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Pak Inarno, very much for the welcome and the opening remarks. Moving on to the next item of our agenda, our next speaker will be presenting an overview of the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance, which was released on the 17th of October. Since its release, the guidance has garnered much interest both regionally and globally, particularly on its tiered approach. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the screen over to Mr. Khairul Ridwan, representing the Securities Commission Malaysia as co-chair of ACMF Sustainable Finance Working Group, to deliver his presentation. Mr. Khairul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ines. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon, everyone. Pak Inarno, Chair of ACMF, Dr. Aidil, Co-Chair of the WCCMD. Very good afternoon to everyone. As Ines mentioned, I, Khairul, am representing the Co-Chair of the ACMF Sustainable Finance Working Group, together with the SEC Philippines. The ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance is one of the initiatives under the working group, but of course assisted by all ACMF members, as well as our consultant Oliver Wyman, and as well as Sustainable Finance Institute Asia. This guidance was delivered on 17th October in conjunction with the ACMF International Conference in Bali, and we're very pleased to have delivered this significant work by the end of this year. So without further ado, I'd like to request the Secretariat to please move on to the next slide, please. So this is the agenda for my presentation today, to provide a background first of the Transition Finance Guidance Initiative, how we developed it, an overview of the guidance itself, and the approach to assessing transition credibility, which is what the guidance is all about, actually, to help entities to do this. And the next steps in this guidance initiative, as you may have noticed from the title, it is the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 1, So it is a living document and will be continuously be developed. So could we move on to the next slide, please? Background and moving on to the next one. So this goes way back in terms of how the ASEAN Sustainability Agenda started and how the guidance arose from it. So the ACMF began its sustainable finance initiatives in 2017 with the issuance of the ASEAN Green Bond Standards. And this was followed by the Social and Sustainability Bond Standards in 2018. So this was, I think, one of the more successful initiatives that we had and kick-started the interest in other areas of sustainable finance. In fact, I think as at to date, there have been 45.5 billion US dollars worth of issuances in all the labeled bonds that I mentioned before, green, social, and sustainability. And also, I think the beginnings of issuances from the latest standards that we issued in 2022, which is the ASEAN Sustainability-Linked Bond Standards. I think it's it's quite modest so far, 27.5 million US dollars worth of issuances. But I think this is relevant to our discussion today on transition because the ASEAN SLB standards helps companies to start their transition journey because unlike the other standards, which are more use of proceeds, and you would have to demonstrate that your project is either qualified under green, social, or sustainability. The SLB provides issuers with an avenue to raise funds for general purposes, as long as it can demonstrate, that it has KPIs and sustainability performance targets that it plans to achieve. So this is in fact, a form of transition, although it is short to medium in conjunction with the relatively short tenure of the SLB. But it is a step in an overall transition journey of the issuer and the company. So we are encouraged by that. But more to the guidance itself. How it started was as a recommendation in the publications that you see on screen there. In 2020, in fact, sustainable roadmaps and reports for the capital market were published by the ACMF and WCCMD, and a transition standard, what we called it at the time, was one of the recommendations in those reports. Now, this accompanied also the recommendation for an ASEAN taxonomy. So I think as you all may be aware, that project, the first two versions of the taxonomy has been delivered, and the ATB is in the process of delivering the entire taxonomy. So now, we, the ACMF and WCCMD, have delivered an initiative which I think is very much related and assists in the taxonomy effort and the transition effort overall with this guidance. So that is, I think, a brief background on that. The next slide, please. So I think what we are aiming for here, and in recognition of the different states of development in the ASEAN region, intra-ASEAN, within the countries of ASEAN, also the differences between the ASEAN region as a whole and more developed jurisdictions, the need for a just transition was a key consideration in planning the sustainability agenda. Dependence on fossil fuels remain high in the region, and the availability of suitable renewable energy sources vary between countries in ASEAN. So transitioning away from these traditional fuel sources would certainly have a social and economic impact on the ASEAN communities. So this was recognized in the reports that I mentioned previously, as well as that issued by ASEAN central banks. So the need for a just transition is an important element in our transition efforts. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of the major transition guidances that have been issued in recent years globally, which the ASEAN guidance took into account in its development. So in September 2020, the Climate Bonds Initiative, CBI, and Credit Suisse issued a white paper on financing credible transitions. And this was born out of a need for some clarity as bond issuers, which did not qualify as green, were using a transition label, which was not entirely consistent. So the guidance sought to provide some clarity there. And subsequent to that, transition was also addressed in various guidance and reports issued by the UNPRI, GFANS, G20, OECD, NZBA, ICMA, among others. On the ASEAN front, on the Asian front, sorry, there's the Asia Transition Finance Study Group and also AREA, among others. So this clearly demonstrated the need and interest to provide some kind of structure for transition among various international organizations, regulators, and financial institution association and groups. The ASEAN Tax Transition Finance Guidance itself was launched in October this year, and it was endorsed by the ACMF chairs meeting the day prior to its launch. Next slide, please. The countries of ASEAN have each made their NDC commitments, and many have also set their targets for carbon neutrality and net zero. So although ASEAN as a region does not have its own NDC or net zero target, it is a significant economic bloc. Globally, it is the 5th largest economic bloc presently and projected to be the 4th largest by 2030, due to surpass Japan and the EU. So hence a transition guide would be a useful resource indeed for the region. And the transition finance guidance is flexible enough to help the individual countries of ASEAN to chart their transition pathways to achieve these NDCs and net zero targets. Next slide, please. A customized approach for every ASEAN country is all the more important given the different starting points for emissions across the region. And energy demand across the region continues to grow, but renewable energy is a fraction of total energy supply. Fossil fuel dominates the supply of energy, accounting for 82.9%, and coal remains the highest among the fuel sources, with 42% of electricity generation in 2021. The next slide, please. So in developing the guidance, we examined the approach and views on transition of several groups of stakeholders in the region. One of these was investors, and on the investors side, what we noted was that investors are more sophisticated in how they view support for the climate transition. A lot of investors now not only use taxonomies to define assets as sustainable, but have also set their own internal science-based targets for portfolio decarbonization. There's also widespread interest in transition finance as an asset class, with investors looking for an increased supply of investable assets outside the traditional definitions of sustainable finance and green finance. So transition is something that they're looking for as an asset class. And many investors operate in multiple markets and want a consistent set of definitions and principles. For ASEAN, there is a need for any principles to be interoperable with global principles for it to be widely adopted. As I mentioned earlier on just transition, among investors also, there is a recognition for this. And an acknowledgement that this could mean a slower transition in emerging economies compared to developing economies, while being consistent with the global transitions to net zero emissions. Next slide, please. Now, we also spoke to issuers, and among the issuers surveyed, there's an increasing number of them who are reporting their emissions, but the scope covered is inconsistent and for many incomplete, as is the scope of business activities. 49% of companies surveyed have a net zero target year, but only 61% had interim targets. And slightly more than half of companies, at 54%, have a transition plan tied to an external source. And the choice of this source or reference pathway was a mix coming from national targets or industry body targets or science-based pathways. And many of the published plans of these issuers lack detail. Only 6 out of 10 companies have reported their high-level decarbonization strategy, of which only 32% have reported a detailed action plan. Next slide, please. So now I'll proceed with an overview of the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance. Next slide, please. So the guidance first seeks to discuss what is transition finance. And in the guidance, it's defined as the investment, financing, insurance, and related product and services that are necessary to support an orderly real economy transition to net zero. And this can be segmented into 4 key financing strategies as laid out by GFANZ, as you can see in the right-hand side of the slide on screen right now. Transition finance also directs capital to transitioning companies across debt, equity, and other forms of financing instruments. And it is a powerful lever to accelerate transition through direct finance towards more ambitious and credible transition plans, creating incentives for companies to develop plans to transition their businesses. Excuse me. Next slide, please. While financing green activities remains critical to global decarbonization, sorry, there's a problem with my computer. Sorry. So while green financing still remains important, investors now recognize that this potentially precludes much of the real economy from gaining or accessing finance. So these are transitioning companies, particularly those in hard-to-abate sectors. They require financing as well to achieve their ambitious climate targets and are also no less credible than already green companies. So examples of such activities that require transition financing include high-emitting activities that are being phased out, intermediate technologies that reduce emissions without delivering net zero emissions, and leading low-emission technologies. So this is critical for ASEAN emerging markets because national regulations, ambitions, and support continues to change. These countries also depend on support from multilateral agencies to drive change. Next slide, please. The ATFG in this regard is intended to define principles by which one may assess a company's transition credibility at an entity level as the basis of financing. The transition guidance is also intended to identify and provide guidance on how to make use of climate-oriented resources to facilitate transition planning and disclosure. So through the guidance, we hope financial institutions can accelerate efforts to direct finance to transitioning companies. And also we hope companies are encouraged to create more ambitious and credible transition plans. In this regard, the guidance can be used as a basis for issuing transition label financing instruments, bonds, and so on, providing financing that supports transition and to build fundamental climate transition capabilities. So essentially a self-test of a company's transition capabilities before proceeding to obtain finance. Next slide, please. So how the guidance does this is by meeting investor demands while reflecting the actual transition pace of real economy companies in the region. It's based on international transition finance guidelines, the guidances and guidelines that I mentioned earlier from GFANS and so on, to ensure interoperability so that this becomes attainable for ASEAN issuers. It addresses how entities may assess or demonstrate a credible transition in ASEAN. It also provides a means for a wide range of investors to support the range of transitioning issuers. And a key objective in developing the ASEAN guidance is to define principles that recognize that different parts of the world will transition at different times and at a different pace. Can we have the next slide, please? So we now move on to the next part of the presentation, which is how to use the guidance. And the guidance essentially aims to assess a company's transition credibility in order to obtain the relevant financing. So this slide shows the overall approach. The guidance defines principles to assess a company's transition credibility and guides on how to use climate resources. Climate resources here meaning frameworks such as the ASEAN taxonomy for transition planning and disclosure. It's voluntary in nature. It's also interoperable with other existing transition guidelines. It is practical, also flexible to be used by countries of varying levels of economic development. So there are two main elements here: climate ambition and robustness on ability to deliver that you should adhere to, to be able to proceed for transition financing. So I'll examine this in detail in the next slides. Next slide, please. So the first element is that of climate ambition. So ambition here is to identify the company's net zero targets and to set out the company's transition pathways on how to reach these targets. Next slide, please. So the first step for this is the current state assessment. So to set the targets and pathways, companies must understand where they currently are. So this involves evaluation of the environmentally material aspects of their businesses. Now, when we talk about environmental materiality, greenhouse gas emissions is the usual metric to measure this. So in this regard, all sources of emissions must be included. Scope 1 emissions, which are direct emissions by the company. Scope 2, which covers indirect emissions from purchased or acquired electricity, energy. And even Scope 3, which are indirect emissions from the value chain that the company is involved in. Next slide, please. So in setting the target, pathways must be set, which are aligned to the Paris Agreement goals. In this regard, either ideally below 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario or well under 2 degrees Celsius. And if the company cannot meet these pathways or targets, then justification needs to be made as to why not. And how specific this is depends on the geographic region related to the company's business. So I think as you will see later on, the two pathways here are not necessarily the only ones which you may aspire to, but we also have a progressing tier, which if there is justifications, you may pursue the transition along those lines as well. Next slide, please. So on the geographical aspect, perhaps a bit more of elaboration on this slide as to how the transition adjusts to the guidance adjusts to ASEAN. So now science-based models do provide specific pathways for most emissions intensive sectors. But in terms of geographic specificity, they can be a bit lacking. And the development of pathways in this regard will be useful to encourage greater support for the decarbonization of emerging markets to have pathways that account for these geographic differences and specificities that could afford the pace that could influence the pace of transition. So both global and specific pathways can be accepted by the market as long as it meets the criteria on temperature outcome and pathway source. Companies may prefer more specific reference pathways that reflect the individual circumstances because of these geographic factors. In this regard, the ASEAN guidance may differ because the use of regional pathways will involve setting different numerical targets for emissions intensity. But this, we feel, reflects the just transition for the region. But nonetheless, the ATFG version 1 emphasizes the need for a science-based justification of such deviations, so that the pathways remain consistent with the global finance institution's ambition to support a global warming target. Next slide, please. So examples of global pathways accepted by the market can be seen here, although it's a bit small. But these include the International Energy Agency, or IEA, as you can see on the first row of the left column. The IEA, and particularly the Sustainable Development Scenario, has been used by the ASEAN Taxonomy Board to help set the amber tiers for the energy sector technical screening criteria. So there are several pathways from the NGFS, the delayed transition below 2 degrees Celsius, net zero 2050, and divergent net zero pathways. Also pathways from the IPCC as well as SBTI and IRENA. Next slide, please. So for this slide is a list of sectoral pathways set by industry. The Mission Possible Partnership addresses efforts for net zero for 7 industry sectors. You also have the pathways for transportation, IATA for air, and the International Maritime Organization for maritime, and so on. So these are just examples of the pathways that companies in these sectors can rely on in setting their targets. Next slide, please. For the subsequent step, the company must then set a trajectory for emissions target that is the same or more ambitious than the reference pathways. So there must be this commitment to progress. and the company cannot just show a performance that is business as usual. There must be a level of ambition. Next slide, please. So the next element, the second one, is the robustness of the ability to deliver. Now, in this regard, the company must demonstrate the ability to implement this transition. So next slide, please. So the first part of this is the implementation strategy. So in this regard, for the action plan, there should be a detailed roadmap of activities to achieve the transition targets by identified milestones. So this must be separated into near, midterm, and long-term actions. There also should be a capital allocation plan to detail the financial requirements needed to execute the plan. And also the risk assessment and mitigation. Identify climate-related opportunities and risks. Also the identification of key assumptions underlying the entity's action and capital allocation plan. Next slide, please. Ongoing monitoring, of course, the company must develop organization and activity level processes to track the progress of meeting these transition targets. And of course, the most important of all, the governance to monitor and to lead these transition efforts. Now, this ranges from board level, board level items to be put in place. The board or decision makers must approve and oversee the transition targets and implementation of the strategy. Also, the management structure for execution of the implementation plan must be established. It's important also to incorporate the climate focus into the company's culture and systems. Next slide, please. So disclosure is also an important aspect of this, where disclosure must be made where the company has accomplished the key principles for climate ambition and the implementation strategy. It applies both at an entity level and where it is specific to a financing instrument where applicable. So broadly, disclosure should be made in accordance with the International Financial Reporting Standards, IFRS, S1 conceptual foundations. Next slide, please. And an important part of this element as well is independent verification. Verification of the plans can provide more confidence to investors in the reliability of the issuer's disclosures. So entities are encouraged to seek independent verification. And the scope of this independent verification should include upfront assessment of all requisite elements of the transition, the annual assessment of progress, and also ad hoc assessment. It's also encouraged to disclose the credentials of the verifier and the verification assurance report during the term of the financing instrument where applicable. Next slide, please. Just transition consideration and the guidance encourages the companies to incorporate these considerations into the transition strategy where possible. And they must ensure that any forward-looking strategy sufficiently accounts for potentially adverse environmental impacts and also social considerations. Next slide, please. So, as I alluded to earlier, there are three approaches for transition entities. Once you have, done all that, the first two elements, and the three tiers here are somewhat similar to the tiering approach that was done for the ASEAN taxonomy. And the most ambitious tier here is the aligned and aligning 1.5 degrees Celsius. So here the entities that must demonstrate climate ambition that's already aligned or aligning with a science-based 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory and meets all other criteria of transition credibility. The second tier is aligned and aligning, but well below 2 degrees Celsius. And the third is progressing. Now, this applies to entities that demonstrate most but not all of the elements of the ability to deliver, the first or second tier, but have committed to addressing any material emissions in the next 2 years. Next slide, please. So this essentially, in a nutshell, provides you with the step-by-step guide, all that we've covered before. The first step of assessing transition credibility and ensuring that all criteria is met. And the next stage is to evaluate transition targets against the selected transition pathway that was mentioned before. Once this is done, the company will see whether it falls under either the first, second, or third tier. So an important aspect of this demonstrate, I think, the ASEAN transition finance guidance to allow entities and companies at all levels of development and all stages of emissions, starting points of emissions, to start thinking about creating a credible transition plan. I think the important thing to consider is that to start immediately. I think a number of us have gone to COP28, and some of us are still there. But what was notable among the conversations among all participants in the finance and government sector there was that it was notable. They said that 2023 was the year where I think everyone saw the importance of having transition guidance, guidelines, and plans. But in the coming years, what is important is the actual implementation of the transition plans. 2024 should be the year of companies starting their transition journey. So I think that's a very important aspect that everyone is realizing now, and that we should take forward. Next slide, please. So next slide. This essentially shows that a comparison between the ATFG and other existing international transition finance frameworks, and that the ATFG is largely aligned with these existing global standards. Could we go to the next 2 slides, please, on the potential areas of consideration? Yeah, so these are essentially the next steps going forward. Firstly, this is version 1, and I did mention that it will be subject to consultation and further developed. But these are some other aspects which I think the ACMF could consider going forward. So the first is an ASEAN transition certificate. Bearing in mind the increasing demand for assurance, from investors. So verification or certification could go far in providing comfort to investors of the seriousness and credibility of a transition plan. A guidance on transition label financing instrument, because the current guidance is principles based and examines transition credibility assessed broadly. So It doesn't specifically go into the various transition instruments. So a possible guidance on that could be done. And also guidance suggests that government and industry-led pathways may not be ambitious as science-based targets. So as these pathways evolve and become more ambitious, then more consideration is needed to develop guidance based on such pathways. And finally, guidance for transitioning enablers. So transitioning enablers refer to companies that contribute to but do not have substantial control over sectoral emissions. Now, examples of these are power transition companies, airports, shipping ports, and so on. So they often lack transition pathways. Future iterations could assist in that regard. Next slide, please. So I've come to the end of my presentation, and I think it's about time because I'm preventing you from the more exciting part of this event, which is the panel discussion. So these are the links that you may access the transition finance guidance. Perhaps this screen will disappear shortly. So perhaps if I could request the secretariat to perhaps put it in the chat as well, so that our participants can link to it later. So okay, thank you very much for your attention. I'll pass the mic back to Ines. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khairul, for that insightful presentation. The release of the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance signifies an important step in ASEAN's transition journey. It addresses how entities may assess or demonstrate a credible transition in ASEAN to obtain financing from capital markets. Our panel discussion this afternoon will discuss the application and utility of this guidance in the context for ASEAN. To moderate this session is Mr. Eugene Wong, CEO of the Sustainable Finance Institute of Asia. Joining him is a panel of experts: Kelvin Lester Cayley, Commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission Philippines; Timothy Collier, Partner at Oliver Wyman; Anjali Viswamohanan, Director of Policy at the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change; Peter Rosenkrantz, Financial Sector Specialist at the Asian Development Bank; and Chuan Sheng O-Yong, Green Bonds and ESG Analyst for APAC from BNP Paribas Asset Management. Before we begin the panel, we will have a quick photo session. So if I could please invite everyone to switch on their cameras. This will include all panelists, the moderator, and our speakers. So Pak Inarno, the chair of ACMF 2023, Dr. Aidil Shari, the co-chair of the ASEAN Working Committee on Capital Market Development, and Mr. Khairul, the co-chair of ACMF Sustainable Finance Working Group. I'll hand it over to the secretariat to take a few screenshots. So if everyone could please look straight into the camera, give your best smile while our secretariat takes the photos. Thank you. All right, I believe the photos have been taken. So thank you very much, speakers, panelists, and moderator once again. If the moderator and all panelists could remain on camera for the next session. With that, I will hand it over to Eugene to kickstart the discussion. Eugene, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ines, and thank you very much to the panelists for spending their time to be with us and sharing their wisdom, and thank you very much to the audience for being here. Well, some of us have just come back from COP28, and we can safely say that transition was one of the biggest and most important areas of the discussion at COP28. And I remember when we started looking at transition in Southeast Asia, particularly at the ACMF level, many people said it was really an offshoot of greenwashing. And we started talking about transition back in 2017 as we were creating the ASEAN Green Bond Standards. And we started to focus on transition a lot more in 2019. But today, if you look at what's happening, everyone is really trying to get into transition, especially given the global climate that we are facing. So everything ranging from the geopolitical situation to the failure of renewables to deliver at some point of time because of the change in the weather patterns, which happen in Europe and in China. Issues to do with inflation, cost of living, high interest rates, And of course, bottlenecks, because we have bottlenecks in the renewable energy rollout, for example, that caused by, again, as I mentioned just now, rising costs and inflation, supply chain constraints, grid curtailment, and the likes. So I think actually transition has become the new battleground in sustainable finance. And really, we can't forget that we are fighting a war with two battles. The first is actually for us to address the impact of climate change. And the second is actually for us to ensure that we have equitable and fair development. So if you lose either of these battles, you lose the war. And that's why just transitions have become so important. And there is this huge emphasis in Southeast Asia, particularly at the financial regulators level, for a orderly, just, and affordable transition. So the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance is actually the next big innovation from ASEAN after the ASEAN taxonomy. And in this panel, what we'd like to do is to discuss how we're dealing with transition in ASEAN, given the unique circumstances that we're facing, as well as the role of the newly published ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance in assisting entities in charting their own transition pathways. So we want the panel to be able to explore how the guidance builds on the existing transition guidelines and frameworks today available internationally to create a guide that encourages action amongst our entities to begin their transition journeys sooner rather than later. And I will also invite all of you to in the audience to post questions on the Q&A, because what we'll try and do is either weave it into the session or answer those questions later on. So I just want to come back to the guidance itself. And as I mentioned just now, there are quite a few transition frames out there today, as Khairul had mentioned in this presentation just now. ASEAN's always looking to reduce fragmentation. That's why we have the ASEAN taxonomy. But this time, it's also come out with its own transition finance guidance. And I really want to turn to Commissioner Kelvin Lee, who's Commissioner at the Philippine SEC and also co-chair of the ACMF Sustainable Finance Working Group, on why a regionally contextualized transition approach is needed to support sustainable finance in ASEAN, and what motivated ACMF to create this particular guidance.
Thanks for the question, Eugene. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm just going to check quickly the AirPods now. I'm guessing everyone can hear me. Great. Well, it was as Eugene mentioned, I sit as a deputy at the ACMF. I'm also co-chair with Pak Khairul at the Sustainable Finance Working Group. I also sit, oddly enough, in the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. So there's a lot of interconnected positions that I'm dealing with right now, and it consisted in all these positions is the need for transition. The debate and the discussion on transition was something that was always highlighted whenever we talked about the different working documents that we were working at the time, which included the taxonomy, among other things. So it was clear that there was a very real need for a regional contextualized approach to support that form of sustainable finance within ASEAN in order to meet the different sustainable finance targets. And I'd like to point out that in particular, even as early as the drafts of the ASEAN taxonomy were issued, the discussion on the taxonomy, on the transition side of things, were already very evident by the need for us to create the traffic light system. I'm sure everyone is aware that there's a traffic light system: green, amber, and red. Amber, in effect, is transition to a certain extent. So I guess the point is, this is something that we were all aware at the time, as early as almost a year ago, I think, that there was a need to have this rolled out to help our ASEAN member states, our AMSs, to be able to meet the requirements and the needs provided for by, part of the motherhood statements, the needs and the requirements required by the Paris Agreement on climate change, and of course the UN SDGs. Now, I'd also like to point out that I'm sure Khairul mentioned this already, but I'd like to highlight that even though there's already the issuance of the ASEAN, the ATFG, the Transition Finance Guidelines, and there's also the ASEAN Taxonomy, I'd like to point out that they complement each other. That this is very important to remember, because I'm sure there are some who are thinking that there's another issuance. Why is there's another issuance? They are supposed to complement and work with each other. The ATFG builds on this traffic light system and the plus standards within the ASEAN taxonomy. It's supposed to create an approach to assess the forward-looking plans of companies, and of course, to help facilitate investor support for those companies when they go on their transition journey. And so in other words, to be considered for transition finance, companies will have to demonstrate how they intend or or are looking to transition their operations and use of technologies for that purpose through the tiers defined in the ASEAN taxonomy. And so by making sure that all these are intertwined, what's another word, streamlined, aligned, the ACMF was hoping to ensure that the ASEAN member states can meet the different environmental objectives provided for and agreed upon. So I think I'll stop there, Eugene. I hope that that's quite a mouthful already. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. So that leads me to ask Tim, because Oliver Wyman was the knowledge partner for this particular piece, and I understand Oliver Wyman will be continuing to support ACMF as its knowledge partner for the transition finance guidance as it progresses and moves forward. Tim, what drew Oliver Wyman's interest to be the knowledge partner for this project? Why did Oliver Wyman think that this initiative would be able to make a difference?
Yeah, well, I guess I should start by thanking ACMF for working with us on this. It's been a great pleasure to be involved in this, and we think it can be really impactful for the industry. So I guess when we started the conversation, we had spent the last couple of years working with other banks in the region to help them set net zero targets for their finance division. So thinking about different sectors, putting away pathways, and then thinking about the strategies that they would need to deploy to be consistent with net zero. And I think a few things had really leapt out to us from that work. So the first was just how important the transitioning of existing high emitting companies is if we're going to get anywhere near net zero. So all of those strategies rely as the number one action to have existing companies that are currently in high emitting sectors change their business over time. So having more support from the financial sector for transition plans was really critical. I think a second thing that was clear is that there was a bit of a disconnect between the way in which the financial sector was looking at transition, what people were asking for, and the types of transition plans that were coming from the real economy. So we felt there was a real need to clear the market by coming up with a set of standards that was investable from one side but was achievable from the other side. And that was really the kind of guiding principle behind these. And the third one is, particularly as we looked across ASEAN, that simply relying on global standards wasn't really enough and it wasn't really fair. So we had spent a lot of time thinking about how can we split out a global pathway towards net zero into a regional pathway which is appropriate for the region that we're in, and the stage of economic development, the age of the assets that we have, all of that needed to be a bit different. So what we wanted to do was to try and bring some of that thinking into setting the standards so that we could create something that would clear the market. We could bring some of that regional pathway thinking into the discussion as well, so that we could recognize that Germany and Cambodia are not going to be transitioning at exactly, they're not starting in the same place, they're not going to be transitioning at the same pace, but starting from different places, moving at different paces, they can still be equally contributing to a pathway towards net zero. So this gave us a fantastic opportunity to put some of that thinking into action, to kind of scale it up, and we're really optimistic that this can unlock a lot of capital for transition in ASEAN.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. So I want to touch on a point you made, which is the disconnect between the financial sector and the real economy, as well as this point about countries moving at different paces. This is a developmental issue, and certainly I know that the Asian Development Bank has been working very hard to create structural change. So Peter, I'd like to maybe ask you about how the ATFG fits into your efforts, because I know the ADB has been putting so much support into helping the ASEAN and indeed the developing countries' economies become more resilient, and also to be able to transition in a very equitable and just manner.
Thank you so much, Eugene, and it's a really great pleasure and privilege to be part of this exciting panel. So let me start by reminding all of us that the ASEAN region is particularly vulnerable to climate change, as we all know. And at the same time, it is a very vibrant and dynamic region, but yet it is exposed to natural hazards and climate change challenges. And not only that, we also do observe increasing frequency in those natural hazards, such as typhoons, storms, droughts, and other related climate change issues. And at the same time, the region, Southeast Asia, was responsible for around 6.5% of global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions in 2020. And Asia as a whole is the largest current source of emissions in the world. So this, of course, underpins the need to transitioning to low-carbon economies, even as the region continues to thrive in economic terms and, become stronger. And we also, when we do this transition, we also need to assure inclusive and sustainable growth. All that together calls for really urgent actions on innovative finance, and that is really, really crucial to fund this transition. In this transition, capital markets, therefore, it's really the wonderful event by the ACMF, play a very vital and important role, as they can effectively mobilize funds, as we know, and redirect or guide investors or redirect investments to green projects, ultimately fostering green finance and a climate transition. In order to facilitate all these efforts, a common regional taxonomy or even a specific transition finance guidance building on it, as we see here in ASEAN, can play a critical and also catalytic role. It allows for investors and issuers to better become aware of the details and compare an investment's contribution, for example, to climate change, and in a way to gauge the green footprint of an investment. And that's what the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance really serves as a common standard, guiding what constitutes a credible, transparent, and inclusive transition. And it's also very nice to see that this guidance really builds on and complements on the ASEAN green taxonomy. And also pleased to hear that the ACMF intends to build on and further strengthen the transition finance guidance also in the form of a consultation. And we as Asian Development Bank, we have been very, very pleased to support a number of efforts with the ACMF, including on the ASEAN taxonomy, its update, as well as the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance. And we are very, very happy to continue our support.
Thank you. Please.
Okay. Perhaps one point, two quick points, Eugene, if I may. I mean, I'm also very pleased to see that other regions accept the ASEAN taxonomy. For example, Abu Dhabi International Financial Center classifies the ASEAN taxonomy as an acceptable green taxonomy. And for our part, just to close my brief answer, ADB, we see ourselves as the climate bank for Asia Pacific. Our ambition is to ramp up climate finance up to 100 billion in cumulative finance up to 2030, and that of course is also supporting a transition, including in ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. So we heard a lot about the need to contextualize transition for the region from the speakers just now. So I want to turn to Shane and Anjali, who are representing the market, to ask, why do you see this contextualized transition as important from the market perspective? And Shane, how do you see it helping your work as a market participant? And Anjali, how do you think it can help your members? Because I think it's interesting to explore where you feel the biggest benefit from the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance will be to the market.
Yeah, so let me start before I hand over to Anjali. So from my perspective as a representative of an investor, a global investor investing in different parts of the market, including ASEAN, what we're looking for is opportunities, right? Opportunities to invest, right? And ASEAN, like what Peter mentioned, represents a very vibrant, diversified, and a growing place for companies, a place where people's lives can be improved significantly over decades. So that represents those kind of opportunities for us. In the context of transition, what we want to do and why contextualization is so important is because we want to keep as many opportunities as we can. Credible opportunities, don't get me wrong, not that we're trying to justify any sort of companies, not that we're trying to justify any sort of investments, but what we want to do is to be sure that the opportunity set do not decrease or is not kept small for the wrong reasons, for comparing companies here against something else, against what a European company should be doing, or compared to a North American company should be doing. What we want to do is to say how companies in ASEAN should be compared to against themselves in a very fair, in a very just sort of situation, in order for us to have adequate opportunities for us to contribute back to societies in ASEAN. To give a parallel in cooking, right? Let's say we are looking at a chicken rendang. Someone in Europe might have a very different interpretation of what chicken rendang really is. It's not fried chicken. We know that chicken rendang should not be fried and has to be done properly with the right spices, right? And so I think the ASEAN taxonomy, the ASEAN transition finance guidance provides us with certain principles, provides us with dictionaries for us to make a good chicken rendang for ASEAN, and that's how I like to think about that. Anjali, what about you? How does it help your members at AIGCC, which we are very proud to be part of as well?
Thanks, Cheng, and thank you, Eugene, and everyone else for having me join this panel. Maybe just before I respond to the question, I might just give a context of what AIGCC is. So the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change is a membership organization for investors. So we work with both asset owners and asset managers that largely have big presence in Asia. And currently we work with over 70 investor members that operate across 11 Asian markets, a lot of which is ASEAN in Asia. And then these investors manage over 32 trillion USD in assets globally. AIGCC is also the founding member of Investor Agenda, with a co-founder of initiatives such as Climate Action 100+, which I will sort of delve into as the conversation sort of progresses on why this guidance is essential. We also work on the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and the Paris Aligned Asset Owners Initiative. So we sort of bring these efforts that get investors to sort of act more on setting ambition, setting targets, developing frameworks and guidances together with investors and helping them implement these plans through asset allocation, stewardship, policy engagement, and broadly engagement with the wider market. So why I think the ASEAN guidance on transition finance is really important is I think it's really been covered by a lot of the other panelists. But I mean, a broad theme that everyone has sort of been discussing as to where the finance needs to go. Yes, the finance needs to go into green projects, but also finance needs to go where emissions are high to help them reduce emissions. So I think the taxonomy that was released is a sort of very useful guidance to indicate where the finance needs to go, but positioning companies in a better way to sort of receive that finance is, I think, what this guidance really does. It really looks at how these companies are positioning themselves more ambitiously to be able to receive finance and transition. So capital needs to go into transition, but it needs to help companies that have more ambitious transition plans in place to help them move faster. And I think that is what this guidance essentially covers, and that's what's required to help investors sort of invest in these companies that require that capital and have ambitious plans to move faster. I think from an investor side, there's maybe one more perspective to offer. So right before COP this year, AIGCC did an assessment of 183 Asian investors that basically have an Asian headquarters, and these investors manage over USD 33 trillion in assets. And they have, they operate in markets including China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, India, Japan, South Korea, and a lot of the ASEAN markets as well. And what we found is that a majority of these investors have sort of, recognized that climate is a real risk and are setting plans themselves on how to respond to it. And they've set, long-term targets, but it is a very minimal number of these investors that are able to set short-term targets, which is quite integral to sort of help them move. And I think what we've seen is that it is less than 36 investors that have actually set short-term targets. And this is really dependent on the companies being able to set set transition plans, and that feeds into sort of investor targets. So I think these sort of guidances will help investors understand the markets better and allocate capital better to get the markets to move on transition. So I think all of this comes together really well through the transition finance guide.
Thank you, Anjali. So both you and Ching raised some very interesting issues, and I'd like to come back to that later. But Ching, firstly, I love your chicken rendang example. We will actually be hosting a webinar on credible chicken rendang next month, and I invite you to also participate in that. But in the meantime, if I can come back to what you said just now, you talked about the principles and how it can actually support the market in being able to facilitate that sort of credible guidance. And certainly the ATFG tries to help both users of capital and providers of capital sort of converge in the understanding of what the credible transition is. But what are the features of the ATFG that you find most useful for the market on a more granular basis? And Peter, I'd also like to ask you this question as well. How do you think that the ATFG can support the ASEAN sustainability agenda? Perhaps we can start with Shane first.
Yeah, and maybe I'll give 2 points here. I think let's start off with how the user of capital. So when we invest into companies, into borrowers, into equities, right? So what can these companies do? How will they use it? Like, what do I think they will find useful with the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance? One is that the guidance summarizes all the different existing pathways out there. You have SBTI, ACT, TPI, different sectors as well. I think what the guidance does has one is to do a lot of work into putting into one single place, where if you were an aluminum manufacturer in ASEAN, and if you go to this guidance, you say, okay, there is this pathway provider out there, or this pathway modeler out there that has done something for the aluminum sector, right? And therefore, I can use it. I can straight away go to it rather than doing a lot of the homework myself. So it saves, I think, companies quite a bit of time in trying to understand where, trying to identify where do they start in all of that. So that's one good point within the guidance. But I think the second point is perhaps more important, and it's definitely the purpose of the guidance itself. And that is, if I need to present, if I need to deliver to my investors, to my bankers, to capital providers, how I as a company is transitioning credibly against ASEAN relevant taxonomies, ASEAN relevant pathways, the guidance provides me a good structure of how I can deliver the information. First, starting with what is my ambition, and I would fill up that what goes into that, and two, what are the things that would deliver my targets, my CapEx plans, my actions required. So the guidance provides a structure for companies to then fill up the blanks, which then gets received by investors like ourselves, which is, again, when things are delivered in a very structured, very easy to understand or logical to understand way, we can digest the information better. We can make better investment decisions with the information. So that's point one. Point two, from an asset manager, from an investor perspective, obviously having those kind of guidance helps us to make better decisions. That's right. But for the practitioners in asset managers, particularly with like say global HQs outside of Asia, this kind of guidance provides us some form of way to justify why the existing global frameworks should be adjusted for ASEAN context. And this guidance provides us with a credible sort of alternative through some of these global frameworks. So I think, those two perspectives are quite useful from my perspective. Peter, what about you from an MDB view?
Thanks so much. So first and foremost, I think it can really make a meaningful contribution to promoting sustainable development in ASEAN. And it, for example, can help mobilize, critical and needed climate finance. I'd like to mention 3 points that I find quite useful, or features of the ATFG that are useful for the market. First, simplicity; second, continuity; and third, feasibility. So first, on simplicity, the ATFG really attempts to break down and explain some of the more challenging concepts related to decarbonization, for example, a credible or science-based pathway, in such a manner that it can be more easily understood and implemented at the enterprise level. On the continuity, it builds on existing work in that area that we have also seen in Kairul's presentation earlier, such as very much aligns with the ASEAN Green Finance Exhaustion, but it also adopts the GFAN's definition of transition finance, for example. So hopefully, this will really help. This will really help in implementing this guidance and to build consensus. And last, also the feasibility dimension. It takes into consideration that there are realities that are at play. So, for instance, the rate at which an ASEAN company is able to align its operations with identified pathways for decarbonization may be affected by a number of factors, including technology, its internal capacity, but of course also finance. Also, the 3-tiered approach, the 2 categories of align and aligning, and also the one on progressing, very much targets and aims to make it implementable and feasible in the ASEAN context. Having said that, of course, there's still a lot of complexity and need for better and more practical understanding of transition finance. We're all learning. Also, the financial institutions are learning, regulators are learning. As discussed and mentioned earlier, we really look forward to developing this further as a partner, and are really ready to support the ACMF in this important undertaking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheng and Peter. Those are really, really useful examples of how the transition finance guidance can be used, and in particular with the taxonomy itself. So Kelvin, if I can turn back to you and ask you, from the ACMF's perspective, when the ACMF was first conceptualizing and conceiving the guidance, what features were you most concerned about to ensure that the ACMF could, through the guidance, address the regional issues that were at large? And I think, Tim and Jali, Peter and Sheng have highlighted some of the needs of the market, and certainly I think that's what ACMS was trying to address. But I also want to ask you about the issue about the member states, because ASEAN has 10 member states. They're all very different in terms of their economic situation, the social structures, the resources that they have, and they're at different starting points, as you mentioned early on just now. So how is the ATFG going to be useful at a member state level in addressing their national needs?
Okay, so two questions there, I see, Eugene. So on the first question, in relation to the features for the ACMF that we were focusing on how to address the regional needs, well, we have to realize that we wanted to ensure optimum interoperability of the ATFG, with the existing so many international and regional transition finance guidelines and frameworks out there. So we identified a couple of common elements, which we some of you touched upon earlier, in those existing guidelines, so specifically climate ambition, and of course the robustness of the ability to deliver. So those 2 key elements are essentially the 2 key principles in the approach to assessing transition credibility in the ATFG. And in fact, through that review, there were of all these different transition finance guidelines and applying it with an analysis of the current state of the current ASEAN market, the ACMF was actually able to formulate the ATFG to address some of these regional issues. For instance, the need for the guidance to satisfy the demands of investors. And we heard some of those demands just now, because obviously a guidance that fails to meet this particular bar would obviously fail to attract capital. There's also the need for the guidance to be attainable for issuers in ASEAN. It has to be practical in the sense that, and attainable in the sense that if the guidance is too high, then investors will shy away and well, the supply of instruments for capital will be almost none. There's also the need for investors to have a standardized concept of where to direct their investments in terms of transitioning companies, because as mentioned, I think someone mentioned it earlier, without the guidance, investors will tend to adopt different standards when approaching the transitions. And of course, because of the fact that different parts of the world will transition different times, different places, different starting points, as there's a need for ASEAN, at the ASEAN level, to define those principles that reflect the global move to net zero emissions. And of course, explain how we can make sure that there's a meaningful amount of capital that flows to a meaningful number of issuers. Now, on that's on the features. On the second point, you mentioned whether it is useful for individual AMS. I'm sorry, ASEAN member states. For those who are not familiar with the term, well, I believe that the ATFG is designed to be useful to individual AMSs to address their national needs, because while global decarbonization in line with the Paris Agreement is contingent upon the progress of the real economy companies, the guidance primarily aims to accelerate efforts of financial institutions to direct finance to transitioning companies and to create incentives for real economy companies to create more ambitious and credible transition plans. So it helps the individual ASEAN member states to meet their nationally determined contributions to the COP, and of course all the other requirements inherent in that. In fact, in the Philippines, it might interest you to know, the release of this particular ATFG has spurred several discussions internally already in the SEC, the Philippine SEC. We've already looking at several initiatives to work in this direction, towards the effort of global decarbonization. We're actually considering applying and adopting a localized version of the ATFG here in the Philippines. And on that point, secondly, we're also studying possible guidances, in that context, guidelines. We're also looking at possibly issuing guidelines for transition labeled financial instruments, all of which is supposed to help us meet the Philippines' commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by 2030. So I hope that kind of encapsulates where we're coming from on this point. Thank you, Eugene.
It's fantastic, Kelvin. Thank you very much. And speaking of terminology, which participants may not be familiar with, for those participants who joined late, I just wanted to take the opportunity again to thank the panel. This is actually a very wonderful panel because we have people from very different stakeholder segments. Commissioner Kelvin Lee is a commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission of Philippines. Tim Collier is a partner at Oliver Wyman. Anjali Vishwamohanan is the Director of Policy at the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. Peter Rosenkrantz is the Financial Sector Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. And Soncheng Aoyong is the Green Bonds and ESG Analyst for APAC from BNP Paribas Asset Management. So we have a really rounded group of panelists today, and it is really fantastic to be able to interact with all of you. So if I can come back to Tim and Anjali, we've heard a lot about the contextualization and the benefits from that. But one thing I did see from COP28, and I'm sure that those of you who were there, and Anjali, you're still there, would have also seen it, is that we see a growing dichotomy of people. So there are a large number of institutions now who are saying that we've got to really focus on transition because transition is the key. But we also see some FIs to say that, oh no, things are getting very, very bad. We must now start to focus on more green because we are going to miss the target. So it looks like we will have investors and financial institutions who will be very, very open to the well below 2 degree tier as well as the progressing tier in the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance. But if their own ambition is a 1.5 degree, what happens then? How do they use the guidance? And if they also have a 1.5 degree ambition as a whole, how will the well below 2 degree tiers and the progressing tiers actually help the market? So maybe I can start with you first, Tim.
Yeah, happy to. So, I mean, Eugene, this was one of the big questions that we tried to address it with the interviews and the research that we did kind of before coming up with this guidance. So, because we wanted to know, if all FIs were telling us we're only interested if companies have got a plan which is 1.5 degrees aligned, then there wouldn't be any need there'd be no point in having any other standards because no one would invest in them. At the same time, if all of the issuers were telling us the only thing we can do is progressing, we have a problem with the market not clearing. What we actually found was a much more nuanced picture. So your financial institutions, a lot of them have got a 1.5 degree ambition of their own, but they recognize that that is a portfolio story, and they're going to achieve it in part by investing in outright green and sustainable activities, in part by having companies that are transitioning really fast, in part by supporting companies that are transitioning a bit slower as well. And that they also were sympathetic to the idea that different companies start in different places, that there's a different pace for different regions. At the same time, when we look at the actual transition plans that are being put forward by real economy companies, what you find is, on the one hand, they're relatively early in the journey. So a lot of those plans haven't yet gone through the work of working out exactly where they are versus a science-based pathway. Many of them don't yet have all of the elements that you would want to have in terms of the quality of the action plan, the capital allocation plan, the independent verification, etc. So they're doing the right thing, they're moving in the right direction, but they're not going to qualify on all of the elements that we'd ideally want to have in the transition plan. And I think that was why we felt it was really important that you have multiple tiers, so that, as Comcarbon was saying, you get a meaningful number of companies that are investable, and that are at the same, and that the financial institution can invest in and say, this is a company that I should be supporting because they are transitioning. I recognize that they're not yet transitioning as fast as I want them to, so I'm going to engage with them and see if I can speed that up. But I'm going to recognize this as transition finance and as me doing something which is supporting the transition towards net zero.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. Anjali, I saw you nodding in agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Tim. And I think one of the benefits of sort of working at an organization like AIGCC that sort of engages with multiple types of investors that are asset owners and asset managers, it's interesting to see everyone has sort of a different approach. So I mean, I think you will find investors that are interested in every category, and I think that's what we are sort of hearing from investors. And I think at COP that's been a theme as well. You're sort of discussing really hard on the hard to abate sectors, the high emission sectors, and how to get them to transition faster. And there are funds being created within these investors to help these companies that have set ambitious transition pathways to help achieve them. So I think there is a lot of work that's been happening within the financial industry in terms of innovation and creating funds that will help, that can be directed towards companies that have set progressive plans on transition. And I think these sort of categorizations and the planning behind it will really help the financial industry sort of categorized where they need to sort of direct finance to help the whole market move. So I guess the perspective from my side is that we are seeing, a lot of financial institutions interested in engaging, understanding company level plans and allocating capital to where it really needs to go to help companies transition. So, I mean, I think the categories are important because it helps investors identify which companies to sort of engage with to help in different transition objectives. So I think it works really well.
Thanks, Anjali. That's really insightful. You talked about ambitious transition pathways. Tim, I'd like to come back to you on that particular comment. I mean, the issue of pathways has always been a very difficult one. And it's really hard to negotiate regional sectoral pathways because it means there has to be winners and losers. But the ATFG does has to come back to a regional contextualization as well. So how does the ATFG address the pathway issue?
Yeah, so Eugene, I think it's really key. So to my way, I think one of the big scientific developments of the last few years, which has enabled a lot of private sector involvement, has been the development of sectoral pathways by independent scientific groups. So we know that we can't simply rely on government policies because government policies don't add up to 1.5 degrees. They're not net zero in totality. So we need an independent view that says, if we're doing this, this is enough. And so groups like the IEA and the Network for Greening the Financial System and others have really done have been incredibly helpful in putting together those downward sloping lines and saying, if you aim for this point in 2030, that's good enough. All of them recognize that we start at different points in different places in the world. The starting energy mix of ASEAN is not the same as the starting energy mix of Europe, for instance. And they all recognize that because of various features of the economy, not least the current stage of economic development, the need for additional energy supply and security, and the current age of assets that we have, we're going to be moving at different paces as well. So as we think about what does that then mean for a regional pathway, I think we need to follow the same approach that got us to those sectoral pathways in the first place, which is we need to follow the science and take the scientific view on what is a fair view of different countries. Now, those exist, but I think if there's anybody in the 480 participants who's from the academic community, I think one of the things that the academic community can still do a lot more to help us is to continue to work on those regional pathways. We have some, they're okay, but if we can get more granularity of the regional fair contributions in future, that will help us more to be supporting transition in more parts of the world.
So Tim, the guidance now looks at how we can use as proxies existing national or regional pathways.
Yeah, that's right.
Provided that if there are deviations from the more global perspectives, we're able to scientifically explain the variances then. That's
right. So I think, Eugene, where this is really important is that the guidance is saying when we assess whether a company is 1.5 degree aligned, what we are judging is, are they aligned to a regional view of the fair share of contribution towards 1.5 degrees? And I think that is a really important statement to make, which is you don't need to be aligned to global, you need to be aligned to the regional share of what that 1.5 degree pathway looks like. Now, the practicalities of doing that, it's kind of possible, but not ideal, because I think those regional pathways are not yet ideally created. But the principle, but that is something that we can do, is really important and especially for a region like ASEAN.
Great, thank you. Well, you talked about starting points being different, and we all talked about just transitions, orderly transitions just now. So certainly, while the transition finance guidance does look at how a company can actually transition its operations to meet a Paris Agreement target, we're also not ignoring the fact that we need to have a look at the impact of the company on certain other aspects, particularly the just aspect of the transition. So, Kelvin, orderly, just, and affordable transitions have always been a focus of the ACMF. In fact, it's kind of embedded in all the work you do. And the transition finance guidance looks to ensure that any forward-looking transition strategy also sufficiently accounts for potential adverse environmental impacts such as climate adaptation, biodiversity, sustainable waste and waste management, as well as social considerations such as making sure that there are quality jobs and preventing dislocations and displacements. Can you share with us a bit more about the just transitions aspects of the transition guidance and what ACMF was thinking of?
Yeah, sure, Eugene. Well, in effect, the ATFG, the transition guidance, was supposed to take into consideration, just transition, in that while the ATFG focuses on climate ambition with regard to climate change mitigation on an entity level, this same guidance also encourages companies to incorporate and take into consideration just transition principles in their transition strategy. So as part of the second element of a credible transition for companies to of course, demonstrate that they have the robust ability to deliver on those targets, on their identified targets, companies should clearly and of course very transparently articulate how they intend to account for those just transition considerations. So in fact, the ATFG also encourages making reference to existing guidances. From for instance, for the Glasgow one, the GFANS one frameworks or issuances. They have to take the recommended considerations and actions a company might undertake. And because the ATFG is meant to complement and builds from the ASEAN taxonomy that I mentioned before, companies can also use the ASEAN taxonomy as one of the existing tools to ensure incorporation of just transition into their plan. So the reference to all this gives you an idea of how important just transition was and was taken into consideration in our planning and preparation for all these different issuances. in relation to the ASEAN taxonomy, if you'll allow me, for example, companies based on the ASEAN taxonomy and in relation to the guidance, companies may use the principles under the ASEAN taxonomy, such as the DNSH, the do no significant harm, and the social criteria, for an entity looking to assess their degree of taxonomy alignment with the climate change mitigation focus. For the first one, the user adoption of the DNSH as an essential criteria under the ASEAN taxonomy can help ensure that the activities of the companies towards transition are not supposed to cause significant harm to key environmental or social objectives. For the second aspect, the use or adoption of the social aspects as an essential criteria under the ASEAN taxonomy can help ensure that while a company's activities may contribute to environmental objectives, it's not supposed to result to negative impacts towards employees or surrounding community. So I guess I'm rambling a bit. I apologize for that, but I just wanted to emphasize that it is embedded in the basic doctrines, in the basic way of us thinking and drafting of these things. It is very, very highlighted in the concept and the implementation of just transition. I'll stop there. I tend to get too long-winded when it comes to these things.
I think you're very passionate, Commissioner Kelvin. Thank you very much for that. Actually, I want to come back to Peter, because Peter mentioned about the ADB's 100 billion ambition just now. And a year ago, the ADB launched a Just Transition Support Platform as part of its commitment to ensure that the benefits of the shift to a low-carbon, resilient economy is equally shared, and that no individual, community or region is left behind. So how does the ATG really fit in with your goals, Peter?
Thanks, Eugene. Yeah, indeed, we were very pleased to have established and launched a so-called Just Transition Support Platform last year at COP27. The aim was to assume, in a way, a leadership role in the region on just transition. And again, it's all aligned with our role as the Asia and the Pacific region's climate bank. So this platform aims to address existing knowledge, policy, and operational gaps in this area. And to support that, ADB approved an initial a little more than $2 million of technical assistance in December 2022 to support this Just Transition Support Platform. It really is about enhancing and enabling environment for the just transition of our developing member countries, but also the development and fine-tuning of our ADB operational approaches with our developing member countries. And the platform, in slightly more detail, comprises 4 components. So first, develop institutional and policy frameworks for the implementation of just transition in developing member countries. Then second, it's really about mainstreaming just transition in ADB's operations, so that when we look into our operation, it can be technical assistance, but also lending operations. The lending operations itself can have climate finance components, such as the TAs, that we really try to mainstream that carefully with basically any of our operations, or many. Third is to explore, identify, and promote just transition financing approaches across the board. And last, but also certainly important, is the knowledge component. So to develop knowledge, innovation, and awareness on just transitions, both within ADB, obviously, but also in our developing member countries. And we have already started supporting a number of countries on that through that platform. So if you think about, what I was just saying, the objectives of that platform, and then you look at the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidelines and the objectives, it's very, very much aligned, and the objectives, I think, couldn't be more aligned. And we really hope to also contribute through our platform for a smooth and just transition in ASEAN. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Peter. I think I can really see how the two really dovetail and mutually reinforce each other. I do find it interesting as to how investors will be factoring in just transition aspects when they look at a company's transition pathway. The transition pathway will, of course, provide some clarity on how the company has built in just transition into its pathway. But for investors to evaluate this, it might be a bit of an extra effort. And of course, investors would need to be able to compare the just transition elements of one pathway versus another, and be able to conclude on how that affects their decisions where to invest or whether or not they should invest. Anjali, would you be able to give us some views on this?
Yes. So I think, I mean, just transition is obviously a very complicated topic, and it really differs from region to region, company to company, the areas that it sort of affects. So at AIGCC, through the corporate engagement programs that we have, one of which is Climate Action 100+, which sort of brings together the top emitting companies globally, a lot of which are based in Asia. One of the factors that investors have been using to sort of engage with companies and understand their plans better is one of the metrics is just transition. So you will see that it's become like an integral part of the benchmarking exercise to see how companies are performing against each other on certain aspects of just transition. And under the recent benchmarking assessment that was released just this year, the just transition element was examined for the first 100 high emitting companies, and it's there on the Climate Action 100+ website for everyone to take a look. So some of the aspects that you're sort of looking at to see how companies are really performing on just transition is to see if they're initially committing to a just transition principles in their way of approach and thinking about transition. You're also asking for companies to have a just transition plan in place, which is developed by engaging with the communities within which they operate. And you also ask companies to identify clearly what the performance indicators they are using to sort of develop these transition plans and implement them. I think these sort of elements are really important to help investors understand company level approaches and be able to sort of use them to compare different approaches and identify best practices. But I think the benchmarking of companies and understanding how they perform against each other and identifying good practice is also sort of a great way to start. And I think it sort of feeds well into the transition plan as well that's released by ACMF as well.
Thank you very much, Anjali. So Shane, just to come back to you, I mean, how far do you think that just transitions will be able to influence a transition pathway? I mean, how much will just transitions actually be a part of the transition planning and the transition pathway that's adopted? And how does the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities come into play for transition pathways?
You know what, Eugene, I think what Anjali mentioned and sort of implied is that the term just transition could mean different things to different stakeholders and at different levels. Now, at the company level, like as an investee, a just transition is investing in the future without leaving behind people. A just transition in a global context is making sure that the north-south divide is being brought together, right? That the financial flows, the capital flows is not only in developed markets, but it also flows to where it is most needed in emerging markets, in frontier markets. So I think when we talk about just transition, it's actually helpful to in order for us to contextualize and to really be specific on what we are talking about, with regards to different situations. When it comes to companies, obviously, I think Anjali mentioned that what we want to see is that yes, while companies plan for their transition, plan for their climate targets, they need to also consider how does this affect different parts of their workforce, and what are the plans to mitigate some of these potential negative consequences. From a bit higher sort of perspective, at the regional transition, what we want to see, and going back to your question around common but differentiated, is that the different players, the different economies in the region take up different sorts of responsibilities. For example, in Singapore, right? What are the strengths that Singapore have that can help different can help other economies, can provide capital to different other economies to help them in their transition. And I think MES Not to say that I'm single for it, but pointing out that MES have come out with that pilot program to fund coal phase out. That's because MES and Singapore has that strength as a capital provider, has the strength as a capital facilitator. We need to see also other economies, other markets to say what are their strengths and how they can contribute to the region. And I think even when we transition at different paces, the term common but differentiated responsibilities mean we use our different strengths to contribute to the common goal of delivering emission reductions, even if those emission reductions are at different paces in different economies.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Sheng, that we come from different starting points and we have different resources. And as a result, the pace of transition would differ from country to country. And that's a very important aspect that financiers need to take into account as well. Tim, you and Anjali talked about how you will have different audiences for the different types of financing opportunities available. So those would strictly go for a 1.5, those who are open to a well below 2, and those who are open to supporting companies that are actually progressing, who haven't quite met the requirements for a well below 2 degree transition pathway, are working their way towards. It's important that we develop all the different categories. In your interactions with the market in developing the transition finance guidance, how have you seen the market reacting to this, and how do you think the market will use the ATFG?
Okay, so you, thanks for the question. So maybe I can, well, so almost in parallel to this coming out, we were also asked by the Net Zero Banking Alliance to think about how banks could be starting to set metrics around their efforts towards transition finance. And actually at COP this week, we launched a paper on developing metrics for support to transition finance with the NZBA. And the way that I think that financial institutions are looking at this is, over the last few years, most of them have created a target, which is, I want to do $50 billion, $100 billion, however much, of sustainable finance. And things like the ASEAN taxonomy have allowed them to define what that is. Say, if you fall into the green or the amber tiers, I know what that means. That goes towards my target. That fits into my $50 or $100 billion target. I think all of them now are in a position where they want to do the same thing for transition finance. And I think we will see financial institutions start to set themselves targets that say, we want to be putting hundreds of billions of dollars in the next few years towards transition finance. And we're going to define that using this guidance to say that will mean support to companies that are 1.5 degrees aligned or aligning, or 1.5 and 2 degrees aligned or aligning. Different financial institutions will define that in different ways. But my hope is that they will use these standards to inform their own definitions as they come up with their transition finance approaches, and then feed that into targets and use that to drive more and more capital into transitioning companies.
Great. Thank you, Tim. So I just wanted to maybe have a very short discussion for a couple of minutes with you, Tim, and with Kelvin, as to how the ATFG will be taken forward. Kelvin, would you like to start?
Sure. I hope you don't mind, Tim. No, I'll privilege of youth, I think. I'm guessing I'm younger than you. I'm just anyway. Looking forward to this, moving forward for the ATFG, I would think that as a regulator, I would want it to be treated the same way that the ASEAN bond standards, different bond standards have been issued, and the ASEAN taxonomy, for instance, is being used as a guiding light for different individual countries, AMS states, to create their own taxonomy. So I believe, in my opinion, individual AMSs, individual ASEAN member states, should consider now whether they will adopt the localized version of the ASEAN transition finance guidance. Of course, this further support, the sustainable finance activities in the region. I'm, as I mentioned, the Philippines is looking into that. I have a team starting to look into localizing the ATFG here in the Philippines through an issuance of our appropriate memorandum circular. And of course, since it's a living document, this guidance should have it should be continuously refined, I think. No, so it should keep track of emerging trends. It should adjust as needed. And I'd like to point out, no, speaking of the guidance itself, no, already points out some potential areas for consideration for the future. For instance, it makes reference to that the ASEAN, what was this, the transition certification. No, there's reference to that. No, it's supposed to be able to facilitate regional certification for and recognition for all the different financing instruments. There's also a proposal within the guidance on guidance for transition labeled financing instruments moving forward. There's also proposed guidance, or it suggests also guidance for transitioning enablers, no, on what constitutes transition credibility. So there's still a lot of stuff moving forward. There's still a lot of work moving forward, and I'm hoping that we can all move in that direction, together. Sorry, Tim, I speak too much, really.
Yeah,
please.
Well, I mean, I guess that the most exciting thing for me on this is to hear from you, Commissioner Calvin, that the Philippines is already taking this forward and turning it into a kind of national version, and that's very exciting to see. So, yeah, I hope other ASEAN member states will do the same, follow suit and create their national versions. I know that a number of private sector investors are looking at this and thinking about how they can adopt it themselves in terms of defining their own transition finance standards. And then from an ACMF perspective, I think all the things you just said are correct, right? So if we want to create an asset class, this will need to become from principles based to more quantitative in the way that the plus standard of the taxonomy is. I think we would like to hear from market participants whether that's something that they would want, or whether they feel that the science is too fluid, really, to make that possible. I see the three different standards probably evolving over time. We may reach a point where we feel we no longer need some of the different tiers. I think we will see more and more development of the sectoral pathways, in particular the regional versions of those sectoral pathways will be really powerful to help to bring some of this to life as well. So, mostly I hope people just take this up, interpret it their own way, and start using it. But I think there's ways to continue to enhance it as well over time.
Thank you, Calvin, Tim. Carol's slide also showed towards the end some of the anticipated areas to explore. I gather that the ACMF and Oliver Wyman will be also looking at those areas such as the certificate and all that. I was also very heartened to hear from many people I met at COP28 that they found the guidance to actually, I would say, almost break a gridlock, because there are many broad guidances out there, but they haven't been contextualized for a large portion of the market, which is the well below 2 degrees. And they've not been able to sort of bring in those who are progressing. So they see this particular issuance from ACMF as a refreshing opportunity to actually address a wider segment of the market while keeping the credibility. So I think that's really, really good. We have 2 minutes for Q&A. So I would actually like to maybe there have been a lot of questions. Some of them have been answered, but I thought I should ask a couple of questions that have come up. One of them refers to independent verifiers, and perhaps this is a question for either Tim or Kelvin. Who do you see to be the independent verifiers for transition pathways under the guidance itself?
You want me to take that one, Kelvin? So the main group that's doing this at the moment is the Science Based Targets Initiative, the SBTi. They have a methodology by which they assess the transition plans, particularly the targets that companies are setting. An increasingly large number of companies are signing up and getting verification there. My sense is that as we move into carbon accounting being an accounting standard, as it is now with the ISSB, as transition plans become more common, we will probably see the evolution of a independent verification and auditing kind of community that springs up around this. We're not quite there at the moment. At the moment, the main group that is doing this is the SBTi.
Thank you. There's another question which is interesting, and I think I'll open this to all the panelists, because the question is, what's the cost and benefit of using the transition finance guidance?
Let me give my 2 cents here. The cost. Definitely one is finding, spending the time and obviously financial resources to put together your data infrastructure, to put together different people in a room, to hire smart consultants if needed, and probably you will need smart consultants like Timothy, and putting together your starting point, right? Starting up this piece of work is incredibly difficult, and I think that is the cost. But the benefit from doing all of these investments today is that one, you are more likely to continue to access capital, especially if you are in an industry that has high sort of quote unquote transition risk, policy risk, right? So if you as a company is in an industry which faces that kind of high transition risk, putting together all of that information, going through thought process, hiring smart people to come up with to inform your decisions, that's going to help you in the future to continue to access capital, or at least have good conversations with capital providers so that they extend as much as possible the amount of capital you need for the foreseeable future. And obviously, the second point is if you as a company is interested in becoming a leader in your sector, obviously that comes with bragging rights and hopefully also financial return. Having that kind of information to deliver to your investors, I think that is also likely to be a winning formula in the future.
Yeah, I think those are absolutely important points, Shane. And also we have to remember that eventually a lot of the customers in the supply chain are going to demand for their suppliers to be on some form of a pathway. So Standard Chartered did a survey 2 years back, I remember, and they said that a lot of the MNCs are actually considering removing suppliers who are not consistent with their own climate ambitions by 2025. And if that were really to happen, the cost to Malaysia would be 65 billion and to Singapore would be 147 billion. So the transition finance guidance also provides the opportunity for companies to create a credible pathway for themselves that has a bit of regulatory cover that they can show. Because I think transition is about engagement, and it's about showing all your stakeholders that you are able to start a journey and you are on the right track on that journey. So with that, we've actually run out of time. Thank you so much to all the panelists for your wonderful contributions. Thank you to the audience for your questions, and also for staying through with us. I mean, most participants have actually stayed through the seminar itself. So I will hand over back to the MC. Over to you, Ines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugene, and to all our distinguished panelists for sharing their insights today. It has been a fruitful discussion surrounding the importance of transition in ASEAN and how the guidance plays a pivotal role to support this, and hopefully one of many more to come. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to our last agenda item for today. Please allow me to invite Dr. Muhammad Aidil Yusri bin Shari, the co-chair of the ASEAN Working Committee on Capital Market Development, to deliver his closing remarks. Dr. Aidil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ines. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We thank you once again for joining today's webinar. It is great pleasure to have this collaboration between Pak Inarno, Chair of the ACMF, Commissioner Kelvin, Co-Chair of WCCMD, and also Deputy Chair of ACMF, Khairul, Co-Chair of ACMF, SSWG, Eugene, Safia, and the panelists in socializing the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance. I hope this continued collaboration signifies our collective effort towards fostering sustainable finance within ASEAN. It is very interesting to witness the insightful discussion among our esteemed panelists. as they delve into assessing credible transition in ASEAN to obtain financing from the capital market. By establishing this guidance helps to accelerate financial institution initiative to finance transition companies by establishing standardized approach that determines which company should be the primary focus of this effort. The goal here is to streamline the allocation of financial support to companies undergoing significant change towards sustainability. The panelists also discussed on ways to encourage companies' involvement in the real economy to develop more credible transition plans towards sustainability, whereby the aim is to motivate this company to devise and implement plans that genuinely drive substantial change aligned with the sustainability goals. The ATFG is more than a document. It represents our collective commitment to facilitate credible transition in capital market financing within ASEAN. Therefore, by leveraging our collective expertise and resources, this collaboration is important in advocating for sustainable finance practice across ASEAN. Just like the ASEAN taxonomy, ATFG is also a living document and will be enhanced over time to align with the evolving global climate standards, transition approach, the evolving needs of our region and the member states, as well as the advancement in technology. Through the socialization of ATFG, we are not solely facilitating the exchange of knowledge sharing, but also involve creating an environment where companies and entities feel encouraged and empowered to include sustainability as a fundamental aspect of their financial strategies, while fostering a mindset where sustainability becomes an integral part of financial decision-making and planning for organization. To conclude this webinar, I would like to extend my thanks to the panelists for sharing their knowledge and experience, as well as the participants for joining this webinar. I would like also to extend my appreciation to Safia for moderating and arranging this webinar, and to the SAMF for providing clear guidance to stakeholders and aiding them in meeting the expectation for a transition. Thank you once more, and I look forward to our continued collaboration and accomplishment in the journey ahead. I wish you have a wonderful day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and goodbye. Hand over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Aidil. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our webinar session today. Please be informed that the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance document can be accessed by the QR code currently being shared on the screen. In addition, links to the slide deck which Mr. Khairul presented earlier today and to the guidance have also been placed into the chat. Should you have any further questions and feedback on the guidance, you may contact the ACMF Secretariat via the link which will shortly be placed into the chat box as well. With that, thank you once again for taking the time out of your day to spend it with us, and we hope you enjoyed the session. Take care, stay safe, and see you again soon.